How are you all? I hope your day has been great so far, but get ready because the stories I have next are going to make it even better. Just wait until you hear how these people who were there dealt with what they say was the worst thing that ever happened to them. Also, if you like, share, and subscribe, it will make me very happy. Thank you. Let's start the stories now. I did something really stupid when I fell asleep in a boat on the bayou. The number of alligators and crocodiles was high at the time, so it was especially stupid of me to do that. But I had been drinking, and the sounds of the swamp had made me feel better. I gave in to the feeling of ease and fell asleep. When I woke up, I saw what looked like eyes on logs floating all around me. I knew that if I started to row, those logs would get in my way and cause me a lot of trouble. I wish they would just leave on their own. But that was a very silly hope, because the exact opposite happened. One of them got tired of waiting, and made V-shaped ripples in the water as it came straight at me. Now, it could have been the alcohol or the hangover from it. But I saw that crocodile or alligator or whatever it was coming straight for me, and I was ready to run. But then there was a ripple and some bubbles on the water's surface, and the alligator or whatever it was gone. But the others started running away from where I was. I thought the one alligator that was underwater would jump out of the water and hit my boat, but it came out on the other side of the bank and looked like it was trying to get away. I kid you not. A huge black hand with sharp claws reached out of the water, grabbed its tail, and pulled it back under the water with so much force that it couldn't have survived. Now. I don't know how much you know about alligators, but their tails are by far the weakest part of their bodies. The fact that this animal was dragged back into the water by its tail with only one hand raised serious questions about what or who was handling it. A few seconds later, I saw that there was no man there. The man in charge of the chaotic splashing drifted over to the bank, where a huge monster that looked like a slimy wolf came out with a firm grip on the crocs, even as the dead body thrashed around. There was no way out, and for a moment, it was one of the biggest alligators I'd ever seen. I thought the whole thing would turn around because it had an alligator in its mouth and a big monster's head, but it used its two huge claws to grab the sides of its mouth and pull it wide open. I could hear the animal's jaws breaking, so I knew right away that it was dead. Then, this huge wolf monster beat its prey against a tree in a fit of rage. Never see a crocodile get beaten until its brains fall out. I did that day. It was great and scary at the same time. Even though I had just sat down to eat, I couldn't help but feel sorry for him. It literally had no chance to fight back. It might as well have been a puppy in an eagle's claws. If you had met me, you would have seen that my hands are shaking. This is why my voice also shakes. I was so close to dying, and then I saw death in the flesh rise up and beat a predator I was afraid of like it was a toy. I don't go into the bayous because of this. People have told me stories about huge werewolves, but I always thought they were just old wives' tales or silly ghost stories that are told around the campfire to scare kids. I was more surprised by how big this animal or creature thing was until I saw it for myself. It looked like a human, but it was about 8 to 9 feet tall, had a huge Arnold Schwarzenegger-like body covered in thick, long black hair, and a huge wolf head, so it was probably a werewolf. Well, I don't think that people turn into wolves when the moon is full. But this thing looked like what most people think of as a werewolf, except it was much bigger and scarier than I could have imagined. Because of this, I no longer go near swamps at all. I know that these stories are true. I don't know if they are demons, real animals, or something else. I like to think of them as guardians of the swamp, but you could say that about that day, too. I'd like to think that this thing was keeping an eye out for me. My uncle and I were on a fishing trip. I usually don't like that kind of thing, but the man had cancer and was dying. He had spent most of his life trying to get me to like fishing, but he had almost given up. So, all he wanted was for me to go fishing with him, and at least act like I was having fun. I couldn't say no to something like that, especially in those circumstances. I met my uncle on the land he owned. He owned the majority of 3 smaller Tennessee lakes. Well, they weren't really lakes, they were more like big ponds and were in no way considered lakes. It was the kind of land where you could just live off of it and forget that there was a world outside with worries and problems. My uncle pretty much did the same thing. He spent all of his free time fishing and got lost in the fantasy world of fishing until the reality of his illness called. He was leading his death by the leash and all of that. I was one of the first things that came to his mind. How do I say no to something like that? We moved away from the shore by pushing off. I had forgotten that my uncle had so much land. My uncle leaned back in the small rowboat, put his hat over his eyes, and went to sleep. I shook my head and stopped acting like I cared about whether or not my fishing line was catching anything. I love the man, but he's turning into a vegetable while he waits for a fish to bite his hook. Just wasn't really my thing. I was lost in a restless daydream when my line went tight and the rod was pulled out of the boat. It took me a second too long to react, and the whole thing was now gone. I couldn't think of anything big enough or strong enough to take my uncle's stuff away so quickly and with so much force. I wouldn't have to think about it for very long, though. Somewhere in the mist, not close to the water, I heard a lot of what sounded like splashing. Then I heard growling and yelping at the same time. Someone or something was hurting, and it wasn't a fish. Then there was a very angry howl, and 2 dim points of light danced somewhere in the grey void. I did that stupid thing and started driving towards it, worried that I might run into a crazed person or a group of wild animals that could be dangerous if they got caught in the fishing line. I thought the 2 points of light were signs of people, but they were nothing like that at all. Well, it turned out that they were eyes. It reminded me of an old cartoon I used to watch when I was a kid. It was a huge monster that looked like a wolf that had a hook stuck in its body and was struggling to get it out. Its clawed fingers couldn't do the fine work needed to get a small but strong hook out of its body, and the hook was now getting caught in the line. The thing looked angry and maybe even sad. Just seeing it was scary. And if I cared more about animals, I might have thought to help it if it wasn't more than 7 feet tall and didn't walk like you or I do. Werewolves are the only kind of wolf that walk around on their back legs. But I had never thought about being ready for something like that to happen. So I was speechless and didn't know what to do. I threw it away quietly because I was afraid it would smell us and come after us. The line was still wrapped around it when it ran into the woods. I had a hard time telling my uncle what happened to his fishing gear, or even explaining that this thing looks strong enough not to break the line, but that didn't seem to be a problem. The hook looked like it was stuck in its chest. I don't know how or why, but it seemed like it was having a hard time getting it out because it was half in the water and covered in mist. I don't know why it ran away or why it didn't come after us either way. It was absolutely and completely scary. I'm just glad my uncle didn't see it. Poor old man, he probably would have had a heart attack. I'm an adult now, but I'll never forget this story, even though it happened to me when I was a kid. It's one of the scariest things I've ever seen, and it's kept me up at night for years. I was 10 years old at the time, and my brothers were 6 and 13 years old. We were all going on a great trip with our parents. So, that's how we felt about it. In reality, we were in a truck pulling a trailer. We thought we were going to spend a few days driving around and looking for fun things to do during the day and cool places to park at night. When it happened, we were on our way back from one of the fun places, a carnival where I finally got to ride some of the big kid rides, and we were looking for a place to camp for the night. It was early evening, around 8:30 p.m., and since it was summer, it was still pretty light outside. My little brother was fast asleep because all the fun had worn him out, and I remember thinking that I would probably do the same as soon as my dad found a place to park. At that moment, there was a very loud bang from the back of the trailer. My dad stopped and swore, and my mom told him to get out and check it because a deer might have run into the back. She loved all animals, stray or not, so she didn't want to think that it might be hurt and lying out there. My dad opened the door and told us all to stay in the truck while he looked. We did, but we moved around so we could see what was going on. After a few minutes, he went back to the window to talk to Mom, and I remember that he looked kind of confused. The back of the trailer has a big dent, but I don't see any animal anywhere. I can't think of a single animal that could do that and then just leave. Since it was the 1970s and there was much less traffic on the roads and we were in the middle of nowhere, of course we all wanted to go out and see it. It was very unlikely that another car would speed through. So, everyone except my brother Jimmy went back to the trailer. Jimmy had been sleeping through the whole show. We sued, and it was strange how big the dent was. My dad might have said a few more swear words when he tried to figure out what on earth could have caused it. Then we heard the very, very low-pitched growl. My mother told us to get back in the car and lock the doors as soon as she saw what was happening. She was back in 2 minutes, but Dad stayed for only a second. He wanted to know what caused the damage, and my mom was telling Jerry to get back in the car, but for some reason, my dad moved closer to the side of the road where the growling was coming from. All of us had to turn around in our seats to see. And that's when we saw this thing. It came out of the trees on the side of the road. It looked huge, and it was bigger and taller than my dad, with thick black hair all over it. It stood up like a person, and had long arms that hung down. And then there was the head. The head was so big that it didn't seem to fit with the body, which was also very big. Oh, and it was a dog's head. That's right. This thing that came out of the trees and growled at my dad made a huge dent in the back of the trailer without hurting itself. It was a two-legged giant, it goes without saying. We learned a few more bad words, so Dad yelled and ran back to the car. He slammed the door and put his foot on the gas pedal. Bam! Dusty, we were out of there. Seatbelts weren't a big deal back then, so I kept looking back at the side of the road. And it just stood there watching us until we went around a nearby bend and lost sight of it. We drove all night and went much farther than we had planned, but my dad wanted to get as far away from that thing as possible. I sure as hell don't know what it was or how something like that could even exist in our world, but I swear to God that it happened, and I will never forget it.